Amara did not cry when they dragged her to the border. She had no tears left. She had used all of them in the 2 hours before, when Kale stood in front of the entire Silvercrest pack, looked her in the eyes, and told the crowd she was a traitor. The ground was wet under her bare feet. Someone had thrown her out without her shoes. The night was cold, the kind of cold that bites at the skin and does not let go. She wore only a thin dress, and her hands were shaking, though not from the temperature. She was shaking because of what she was carrying, a secret she had planned to share with Kale that very evening, a secret that now felt like a wound inside her chest. The pack house lights were behind her. She could still hear the noise from inside. Laughter even, as if what had just happened in that hall meant nothing at all. Gareth, one of the senior warriors, stopped at the stone border marker and crossed his arms. He was a big man with a flat expression, and he had known Amara since she was a child. He did not look at her now. "You cannot come back," he said. "If you cross this line again, the order is to treat you as a rogue." She looked at him for a long moment. "Gareth," she said quietly, "you know what they said about me is not true." He said nothing. He turned and walked back toward the pack house without another word. Amara stood at the border stone alone. The wind moved through the trees around her, and the darkness ahead was thick and total. She was an Omega, the weakest rank in any wolf pack. She had no combat training, no survival skills beyond what any girl learned growing up. She had no money, no bag, no shoes, and no one on Earth who was coming to help her. She had known Kale for most of her life. His family had taken her in when she was 6 years old, after her parents disappeared in a rogue attack on the outer settlements. She grew up in the pack house as a ward, not quite a member, not quite a servant, somewhere in the space between. She learned to be quiet and useful. She learned not to take up too much room. But Kale had always seen her. Even when they were children, he would find her in whatever corner she was hiding in and drag her back into the light. He taught her how to whistle. He shared his food when the kitchen staff forgot to set a place for her at the table. When she was 14 and the other girls called her worthless because her wolf was too small and too slow, Kale told her that a wolf's size was not the measure of its heart. She had believed him. She had believed in him for so long that she had let herself love him, which was the most dangerous thing an Omega could do in a world built for alphas. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach and made herself breathe. She could not fall apart here. Not at this border. Not tonight. She stepped forward into the dark. The forest beyond Silvercrest's territory was not a place the pack used. No hunts were run there. No patrols crossed into it. The trees were older, larger, their roots running across the ground like thick ropes, and the air had a different quality, heavier, quieter. Animals moved in the branches above her, but none of them were wolves. This was land that did not belong to anyone, which meant it was the most dangerous kind. Amara kept walking. She had no plan. That was the honest truth. She had spent the last several months quietly planning one thing, the conversation she was going to have with Kale. She had been so certain of him, so sure of the look he always gave her when he thought she was not watching. She had built her whole small future on the foundation of that look, and now the foundation was gone, and she was walking through a dark forest in bare feet with nowhere to go. She walked for a long time. At some point, the adrenaline that had been holding her upright began to fade, and the reality of her situation started to press in. Her feet were cut in several places from sharp stones and roots she could not see in the dark. Her legs were trembling. She was dizzy in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It was the particular dizziness of a body under serious strain, a body that needed rest and warmth and care that were not coming. She found a large tree with roots that curved out of the ground in a way that created a small hollow, and she sat down against it. The bark was rough against her back. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. That was when the tears finally came. They came hard and without warning, the way a dam breaks. Not with drama, but with the simple, total exhaustion of holding too much for too long. She sobbed into her knees, pressing her face down, so the sound was muffled by the fabric of her dress. She cried for the girl who had grown up trying to be good enough. She cried for Kale, not for who he had shown himself to be tonight, but for who she had believed he was. She cried for the secret she was carrying, the small and terrifying and miraculous truth that was now hers to carry completely alone. She cried until there was nothing left, and then she sat very still in the hollow of the tree roots, breathing carefully, and she made herself think. She was not dead. That was the beginning. She was cold and hurt and alone, But she was not dead. She had 2 hands and a working mind and a reason, a very specific, very new reason, to survive. The anger that had been underneath the grief the whole time finally rose to the surface, and it was steadier than the grief. It was something she could hold on to. She thought about the look on Cale's face when Celeste stepped forward in the Great Hall and made her accusation. Celeste was everything Amara was not, tall, striking, from a strong bloodline, with a wolf that could hold a room just by standing in it. She was also deeply calculating in a way that most people did not notice because she wrapped every calculation in a smile. Celeste had planted a rogue scent token in Amara's small room in the lower pack house. She had presented it to the Elder Council with 2 witnesses who claimed they had seen Amara meeting with outsiders at the eastern fence. The evidence was thin, but the pack had wanted to believe it. Amara was an Omega, with no bloodline and no allies. It was easy to believe the worst of someone like that. The elders had barely deliberated. And Cale had stood there. She understood, on some level, the position he was in. He had just been formally declared his father's heir 3 weeks prior. The pack was watching him. The elders were watching him. Taking the side of an Omega ward against a daughter of one of the founding families would have cost him politically in ways that could have damaged everything his family had worked toward. She understood all of that. Understanding it did not make it hurt less. A sound reached her then, very close, and every instinct in her body snapped to alertness. Something was moving through the trees, and it was not small. She pressed herself back against the tree roots. Though she knew it was useless, she had no wolf speed, no wolf strength, nothing. Then the shape came into the faint light that filtered through the branches above, and it was not what she had braced for. It was a woman, old, small, moving with the careful steadiness of someone who had learned long ago to trust every step before taking it. She had white hair, dark eyes that caught the faint light, and she was dressed in layers of plain brown and gray cloth. She was carrying a small lantern that threw a warm, low circle of light around her. The woman stopped when she saw Amara. She looked at her for a long moment with an expression Amara could not read. Then she walked closer and crouched down to look at the crescent-shaped birthmark on Amara's left shoulder, the one that had always been there, the one that most people assumed was simply a peculiar mark with no meaning. Amara had been told once that birthmarks sometimes ran in old bloodlines, but she had no bloodline to trace, so she had never thought much of it. The old woman stared at that mark for a long time, and then she let out a breath that sounded like something between a prayer and a sob. "I have been watching the borders of this forest for 30 years, the woman said softly, waiting for that mark. She looked up and met Amara's eyes, and what Amara saw in her face was not pity. It was something far older and stranger than pity. It looked almost like recognition. "You should not be sitting on the cold ground," the woman said. "Come with me. I have fire and food, and there are things I must tell you that will change the way you understand everything that happened to you tonight." Amara looked at her for a moment. She had no reason to trust a stranger in a dark forest. She also had nowhere else to go. She took the old woman's hand and stood up. The old woman's name was Marin, and she did not say another word until they reached a small stone cottage tucked between the roots of 3 enormous trees, invisible until you were nearly standing on it. Inside it was warm and dry, with a fire already burning and a pot of something on the iron shelf above it that smelled like herbs and broth. Marin settled Amara into the chair nearest the fire and handed her a heavy blanket and a pair of thick wool socks without asking any questions. She pressed a clay cup of the broth into her hands. She cleaned the cuts on her feet with a cloth soaked in something that stung briefly, and then stopped hurting. She did all of this in silence, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades caring for herself and the occasional injured creature that found its way to her door. Only when Amara had stopped shaking did Marin sit down across from her and look at her properly. "What do you know about the Moonborn line?" she asked. Amara shook her head. "Nothing. It sounds like old stories." "It is old," Marin said. "But it is not a story. It was a royal bloodline, the first unified ruling line that ever existed among our kind. They did not rule by force. They ruled because the moon goddess herself chose them, generation by generation, by placing a mark on each heir at birth." She paused. "A crescent mark." Amara looked down at her shoulder. "The last moonborn queen had a daughter," Marin continued. "The bloodline had enemies, a faction of alphas who did not want a unified rule. They wanted their own territories, their own power. They came for the child when she was 4 days old. The queen managed to send the infant away with a single trusted woman. To hide her, they placed a seal on her wolf, a suppression old enough and deep enough that it would read as a naturally weak omega to every test any pack elder might run. They hid her in the human world and gave her to a family in a settlement at the edge of wolf territory. The fire crackled. Amara's voice was very quiet when she spoke. My parents. Marin's expression did not change, but her eyes held something heavy. Your parents were not wolves. They were good people who agreed to raise you as their own. When they were killed in the rogue attack, I lost track of you. I have spent the years since searching the packs and the settlements near this forest. Why near this forest? Because the seal is not permanent. As it weakens with age, it begins to reach back toward the place where it was cast. Marin folded her hands together, and it was cast in this forest, in the grove 3 miles northeast of here, in the first hours of your life. The fire popped and sent a shower of small sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind had picked up. Amara sat with all of this settling into her, rearranging things she had believed about herself for as long as she had been old enough to believe anything. The weakness, she said slowly. The pack. They all thought I was just a defective omega. You are anything but defective, Marin said. What is inside you has simply been asleep. It will not sleep much longer. She looked at Amara's hand pressed flat against her stomach, a gesture Amara had not even realized she was making again. Especially now. Amara looked up at her sharply. Marin's expression was unreadable, but her dark eyes were calm. The seal knows what is happening inside you. It is already beginning to respond to it. She paused. How far along are you? Amara stared at her. 2 months, I think. I was going to tell him tonight. You were fortunate that you did not, Marin said. If Celeste had known, she would have moved faster and made certain you did not leave that pack alive. She rose and went to the pot above the fire, adding something from a small clay jar. You are safe here. This cottage is warded in ways that pack wolves cannot detect. You will rest tonight, and tomorrow, we will begin to talk about what comes next. What does come next? Amara asked. Marin looked at her over her shoulder. You survive, she said simply. You raise your children. You give them everything the pack that threw you out never gave you. And then, when the time comes, they will go back and collect what was always theirs. Amara looked at the fire for a long time. She thought about Kale standing in the great hall. She thought about the way he had not looked at her when the verdict was spoken. She thought about the elders, the pack, the crowd that had watched her walked out like something unwanted. She thought about Celeste's smile. And slowly, underneath the grief and the exhaustion and the fear, something new was forming. It was not hatred. It was not even anger. Exactly. It was colder and quieter than either of those things, and far more durable. It was certainty. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach one more time. She thought of the life inside her, or, as she was only now beginning to understand, the lives. All right, she said. Her voice was steady. Tell me everything. Outside, the wind moved through the ancient trees. Inside the small stone cottage, the fire burned on. And in the forest that had swallowed a banished girl whole, something that had been dormant for a very long time began, quietly and surely, to wake. 3 years after the night Amara was thrown from Silvercrest, a merchant who sometimes traded at the pack's eastern gate told the gatekeepers a strange story. He said that deep in the northern woods, far past the place where the pack patrols ended, there was a light that could be seen on clear nights from the ridge above the old river. He said a woman lived there, alone, with young children who played in the clearing near the trees. He had not spoken to them. Something about the way the children moved, the weight and certainty of their small bodies, the way they stood still when they sensed a stranger, had made him decide to go around rather than approach. Nobody from Silvercrest went to look. Why would they? An omega, cast out, surviving in the wilderness, was not something they believed was possible. She had been weak. She had been guilty, as far as the pack record was concerned. Whatever had become of her was her own concern now. They had other things to think about. Kale was formally installed as Alpha of Silvercrest, 9 months after Amara's banishment. The ceremony was large and well-attended. He was strong, intelligent, and decisive. The pack respected him. 3 months after the installation, Celeste's family approached the Elder Council with a formal proposal. and a union ceremony was arranged before the next full moon. It was considered a sound match, a strong female from a founding bloodline, paired with the new alpha, exactly the kind of stability a pack needed to grow. If Kale was quieter than he used to be, no one commented on it. Alphas carried weight. It was expected that they would sometimes seem distant. If the harvests that first autumn were smaller than expected, the pack farmers blamed the dry summer. If two of the strongest senior warriors retired from active patrol that winter, with joint problems that should not have appeared in men their age, the pack healer listed it as coincidence. If the first litter born after the union ceremony between Kale and Celeste never came, not that year, not the next, the pack whispered privately, and the elders prayed to the moon goddess for patience, and Celeste smiled in public and said nothing in private except cold, furious things that the walls of the Alpha Suite absorbed. In the northern forest, Amara was not thinking about any of this. She was busy. They arrived on a blood moon, all 5 of them, born across a single extraordinary night, in the back room of Marin's stone cottage, while the moon outside turned the color of deep amber and the forest went utterly, unnaturally silent around them. Marin said afterward that in 40 years of living in that forest, she had never heard the animals go quiet like that. Not for a storm, not for anything. They were quiet for the duration of that birth, and they remained quiet for a long time after, as if the world itself was paying attention. Amara named them in the order they arrived. Ronan first, the largest, who came into the world with his eyes already half open and who did not cry but simply looked around him with an expression of total seriousness, as though he was already assessing the situation. Kieran second, fast and loud, howling before Marin had even finished the basic checks, a healthy, furious sound that made both women laugh despite their exhaustion. Silas third, quieter than the others, watching Marin's face intently from the first second, as if he was storing information. Dorian fourth, who somehow managed to be charming even as a newborn, blinking slowly and turning his head toward Amara's voice, with a kind of calm attentiveness that seemed impossible in something so small. Orion last, and he was the one who made Marin go very still. She held him for a long moment without speaking. His eyes, which in a newborn should have been the standard unfocused gray common to wolf young, were molten and golden bright even in the low light of the cottage. Marin pressed her thumb gently to the center of his small forehead, and she said a word in an older language that Amara did not recognize, and the candle on the windowsill went out and relit itself. Marin looked at Amara. "They are all going to be extraordinary," she said. "But this one," she looked back at the infant, who was looking back at her with unsettling focus. "This one is something the world has not seen in 1,000 years." Amara was too exhausted to process that properly. She gathered all 5 of them as best she could, let them settle against her, and fell asleep with the firelight moving on the walls and the sound of the forest returning, bit by bit, to its normal nighttime noise. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, Marin had porridge ready, and the 5 boys were lined up in a row in the small wooden cradle Marin had constructed from spare timber, all of them asleep with the dense, unconscious certainty of people who had earned their rest. Amara sat up and looked at them for a very long time without speaking. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. "Nobody does," Marin replied, handing her the porridge. "That's never stopped anyone." The early years were hard in every way that mattered, and unexpectedly full in ways that Amara had not anticipated. Marin was a knowledgeable woman. She had spent 4 decades in that forest, not because she lacked options, but because she had chosen it. She had been, in her younger life, a scholar, one of the rare wolves who devoted their years to the old texts, the histories that predated the current pack system, the records of bloodlines and territories, and events that most living wolves had forgotten entirely. She had followed the thread of the Moonborn line for 30 years before her vigil at the forest edge had been rewarded. She taught Amara everything she knew, and she started the boys the moment they were old enough to sit still and listen, which was sooner than any of them expected. Ronan, at 3 years old, would sit cross-legged on the cottage floor and listen to Marin describe the old laws of the Wolf Nation with the same focused expression he had been born with. He did not fidget. He asked precise questions. He had Amara's dark eyes and a quality of stillness that made adults stop and reconsider whatever they had been about to say casually. Kieran at 3 was the opposite. All motion, all energy, already climbing trees taller than Marin thought was safe, and getting into everything. But even he would stop and pay full attention when something interested him, and when Marin explained how the old warrior codes had worked, how a true warrior fought not for dominance but for protection, Kieran went quiet and made her say it again. Silas gathered information the way some children gathered small stones or smooth pieces of bark, constantly, carefully, always sorting. He remembered everything he heard. By the time he was 4, he had memorized the layout of every significant territory Marin described from the texts. By 5, he was finding what he called gaps in the stories, places where the history Marin described did not quite line up, details that had been softened or removed by whoever wrote them down. Marin began calling him her little auditor, which Silas took as a compliment. Dorian listened to everything differently than his brothers. Where they absorbed facts, he absorbed people. He wanted to know how things felt, how they sounded to different ears, what made one way of saying something land when another way of saying the same thing failed. He was already, at 4, the one who could walk into a conflict between his brothers and resolve it with 3 sentences and a particular tilt of his head. Orion was quieter than all of them, and what Orion did was harder to describe. Things happened around him. The fire banked itself when he was sleeping. Rain moved around the clearing in patterns that did not entirely make sense. Birds came and sat near him without any apparent fear. Marin watched him with an expression Amara had learned to read as carefully managed awe, and she told Amara privately that the seal on Amara's own wolf, which was now almost entirely gone, had been dissolving steadily since the night of the birth, had not been unique. Every child of the Moonborn line was born with gifts beyond the standard wolf ability. What made Orion different was that his gifts were already active when he should have been years from any kind of manifestation. "What does that mean?" Amara asked. "It means the moon goddess is not being subtle," Marin said. Amara's own wolf, as the seal continued to dissolve, was not what she had expected. She had spent her life believing she was simply a weak omega, small wolf, slow shifts, minimal range. What emerged as the seal fell away was something else entirely. Her range, when she extended it, did not stop at the usual 100 or so yards. It extended through the trees in all directions, further than she could measure, picking up information the way a full moon lit a landscape. Not one specific thing, but everything at once. Her wolf was not built for combat. It was built for something older than combat. Awareness, connection, a kind of gravity that drew living things toward her without effort. She understood, gradually, what being Moonborn actually meant. It was not about power in the way alphas understood power, dominance, force, hierarchy. It was about something more like resonance. The Moonborn had unified the wolf nation, not by conquering it, but by making every wolf feel, in her presence, that they had come home. She practiced this in secret in the forest, expanding and pulling back, learning what she was carrying inside her, and she did not tell the boys everything at once. She told them what they could use. She told them who they were in pieces, as they were ready for each piece. She told them about Silvercrest on a winter evening, when the 5 of them were 9 years old, sitting around the larger fire Amara had built in the clearing outside the cottage. They had grown quickly. Wolf children always did. And at 9, they were already tall and broad-shouldered in the way of alpha young, though none of them had shifted yet. That would come later, and Marin said when it came, it would not be quiet. Amara told them simply, directly, and without performing bravery she did not feel. She told them about Kale. She told them about Celeste. She told them about the night she walked into the dark forest with no shoes and no plan. She did not use language designed to make them angry. She told the facts and let the facts do what they would. When she finished, the clearing was very quiet. Kieran was the first to speak. "Where is it?" he said. "The pack. Where is it from here?" "That's not what you need to be thinking about yet," Amara said. "Then when? When you're ready, not when you're angry. There's a difference." Silas was frowning at the fire with the particular focus he used when he was solving something. "The woman who framed you, Celeste, she did it because she wanted the alpha's mate position. That's part of it," Amara said. "And the pack believed her because it was easier to believe a weak omega was guilty than to question someone from a founding family." He paused. "That's not just a personal grievance. That's a structural problem." Ronan said nothing for a long time. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees, looking into the middle distance. Then he looked at Amara. "We're not going back to reclaim the pack," he said. Not a question. "Then what are we going back for?" Dorian asked. "A pack is a territory," Ronan said. "We're not going back for a territory. What's ours is bigger than that." Orion, who had said nothing the whole time, looked up from the fire. His golden eyes caught the light in a way that made them glow. "We go back when we're ready," he said quietly. "And when we don't go angry. We go certain." Everyone looked at him. He was 9 years old, and he sounded like an elder. Marin, who had been listening from the cottage doorway, turned and went back inside, and Amara thought she saw the old woman smile. The years between 9 and 18 were the years of becoming. Marin taught. Amara trained. The forest was their classroom, and their sparring ground, and their library. Ronan studied leadership and law. Kieran built a body and a discipline that would stop grown warriors in their tracks. Silas consumed every text Marin possessed and began corresponding, through careful channels, with scholars outside the pack territories who kept the old records. Dorian learned people, how they made decisions, what they responded to, how trust was built, and how it was broken. Orion grew into himself quietly and completely, and by the time he was 16, small animals were not the only things that stopped and deferred to him. Full-grown wolves that wandered near the cottage boundaries would go still when they sensed him, ears flat, heads low, not from fear but from something older than fear, the recognition of something that outranked everything they had ever encountered. Amara watched them become themselves and felt something she had not expected to feel for a long time. She felt ready, and on a clear morning in the late spring of the boy's 18th year, a horn sounded from the direction of the pack territories, low and carrying, 3 long notes in the pattern Marin identified without hesitation. "The Alpha Summit," she said. "Every bloodline is called." 5 young men stood up from what they were doing and turned toward the sound. 5 sets of eyes found their mother. Ronan was calm. Kieran was still. Silas had already begun calculating. Dorian was watching Amara's face. Orion's golden eyes held something that was not impatience and was not nervousness. It was simply readiness, the kind that had nowhere else to go. Amara looked at each of them in turn. "All right," she said. She said it the same way she had said it 18 years ago to Marin, in a small cottage by a fire, with one hand pressed flat against her stomach and a vow forming in her chest that had never dissolved. "All right, let's go." The road to the summit grounds took 3 days from the northern forest, and the 5 brothers moved through the pack territories like weather, present, unmistakable, and not asking permission. They did not announce themselves. They wore ordinary traveling clothes, plain and well-made, nothing that marked rank or origin. They carried no weapons that were visible. To look at them at a glance, you might have mistaken them for a group of young men on a long journey. Nothing more. But anyone who looked longer than a glance tended to stop and keep looking, with the slightly confused expression of someone who is trying to understand why a shadow is moving against the direction of the light. The wolf in every person they passed felt it before the person did. A tension, a gravity, the instinctive awareness that something with more depth than usual had entered the vicinity. Innkeepers found themselves giving better rooms without being asked. Ferry operators waived their fare. A pair of patrol wolves from the Greywood territory, who stopped them at a border crossing with the usual aggressive posturing of border guards, looked at Ronan for 3 seconds and stepped aside. Ronan did not say anything when this happened. He simply walked through. His brothers followed. Amara was not with them on the road. She traveled separately, by a different path, arriving at the summit grounds from the west on the final morning, while the boys were still approaching from the north. This had been the plan, not for secrecy. What was coming could not be hidden once it began, but for sequence. Her sons would arrive first. The room would form its first impression of them without her. Then she would walk in, and the impression would be completed. The summit grounds were a wide, flat valley that sat at the meeting point of 6 major territories. The host pack, the Crestwood, had set up the usual arrangement: a large open pavilion for the formal proceedings, rings of tents for the delegations, a feasting area, and the neutral fire at the center that all packs acknowledged as the space of shared law. Every significant pack had sent representation. There were alphas, betas, senior warriors, elder councils. The full weight of the Wolf Nation gathered to discuss territory adjustments, trade disputes, and the new laws the Crestwood Alpha wanted to introduce around rogue management. The summit had been called for 3 days hence, but delegations arrived early, as they always did. The real work of these gatherings happened in the corridors and the feasting tents, not in the formal proceedings. Alliances were formed and tested before anything was put on record. Cale arrived on the second day of the gathering period with Celeste beside him and 12 of his best warriors behind him. Silvercrest was a respected pack, not the largest, but with a strong reputation for holding its borders and managing its affairs honestly. Cale had done his job as Alpha with the steady, careful competence he applied to everything. He was 36 now, lines at the corners of his eyes, gray beginning at his temples. He was well regarded. He moved through the gathering with the ease of a man who had been doing this for nearly 2 decades. He knew most of the Alphas present by name. He resolved a small border dispute between 2 adjacent packs over breakfast, with a practical fairness that satisfied both sides. He was patient, he was measured. He was also, and had been for 18 years, quietly haunted. He did not speak about it. Not to Celeste, certainly, who had long since stopped asking. Not to his beta, Oliver, who was loyal enough not to push. Not to anyone. The haunting lived in the part of him that had never fully accepted the verdict of that night. The part that had watched Amara's face when he did not intervene, and that face had been printed on the inside of his chest ever since, showing up at the wrong moments with the particular cruelty of things you cannot undo. He had told himself, at first, that he had done what was necessary, that an Alpha could not be seen to take the side of sentiment over evidence, especially in the first months of establishing his authority. He had told himself that the evidence was real, that the witnesses were credible, that Amara had not been what he thought she was. He stopped telling himself these things after the first year, because he was not someone who could sustain a lie he did not believe. He simply stopped saying anything at all and moved forward, which was the only direction available. He was standing near the neutral fire on the morning of the 3rd gathering day, reviewing a trade report with Oliver, when a shift moved through the camp. It started at the northern entry point, a subtle change in the quality of sound, the way a conversation drops a register when something unexpected enters the room. Cale looked up before he understood why. From the northern path into the valley, 5 figures were walking in. They moved in a loose formation with the natural spacing of people who had spent a lifetime learning each other's rhythms. The tallest of them, the one at the front, walked with the specific quality of a man who has never considered that anyone might not make room for him, not from arrogance but because the thought has genuinely never occurred to him. The one to his left was built like a senior warrior, but moved with a precision that was something else entirely, each step placed with the controlled efficiency of someone for whom his body is a studied instrument. The 3 behind had their own distinct presences, one watchful and cataloging, one relaxed in the way of a man who is entirely prepared, and the last one was the reason the sound changed. He was not the tallest. He was not, on immediate inspection, obviously different from his brothers. But when the group moved, they moved toward him somehow, even when they were not looking at him, the way planets orbit a center that does not need to announce itself. And his eyes, when they caught the light, were a color that Cale had not seen in any living wolf. Alphas began to feel it within seconds of the group's arrival, a pressure, spreading outward from the 5 figures like ripples from stones dropped in still water. It was not aggressive, it was not a threat in the conventional sense. It was simply the quality of something fundamental, a weight that pressed on every ranking instinct in every wolf present, and said, clearly and without language, these are above you. Alphas who had led packs for 20 years found themselves shifting their weight back, a fraction of an inch. Warriors whose instinct was to step forward found their feet making the opposite decision before their minds caught up. Cale felt it in his chest, a specific, sharp recognition that landed in the place that had been haunted for 18 years. Not because he knew who the 5 were. He did not know, not yet. But something older than his rational mind knew, and it was already responding. Ronan stopped walking in the center of the gathering ground, where the paths from all 6 entries met. He looked around with a calm, sweeping assessment, as if he was taking inventory. The other 4 stopped behind him. The Crestwood Alpha stepped forward. He was a capable man, broad and direct, and to his credit, he did not pretend the situation was ordinary. "You are not announced," he said. "We were not invited," Ronan replied. "We came anyway." "What pack do you represent?" There was a brief pause that felt longer than it was. "We don't represent a pack," Ronan said. "We are here to represent ourselves." He let that sit for a moment, and then, because Dorian had recommended the specific words in advance, he added, "Our business is with the Council of Elders and with the Alpha of Silvercrest. We will wait until they are assembled." Cale did not move. Oliver, beside him, said very quietly, "Who are they?" Cale did not answer. He was watching the 5 figures with the feeling of a man who is standing at the edge of something he is not ready to fall into. One of the senior elders from the Crestwood, an old man named Warren, who had attended summits for 40 years, walked forward to get a closer look at the 5 arrivals. He was methodical, unhurried. He looked at Ronan, at Kieran, at Silas, at Dorian, and then he looked at Orion. He went very still. He looked for a long time. His face changed in the way of someone who has spent their whole life studying for an exam and is now holding the paper in their hands. His knees bent slowly, and he knelt. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the opposite. It was the gesture of someone who has been relieved of a burden they did not know they were carrying, a simple, whole-body acknowledgement of something he recognized beyond the reach of argument or doubt. Every eye in the gathering was on him. In a voice that carried clearly across the silent valley, Elder Warren spoke a single title. It was old enough that most of the wolves present had to search their memories for its meaning, and most came up empty. But some of them knew, and the ones who knew felt the ground shift under them. Dorian looked at Ronan and gave the smallest nod. The timing was right. From the western entry path, without hurry, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been walking toward this moment for 18 years, Amara stepped into the gathering ground. She was 40 years old, and she wore simple traveling clothes, and her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. She carried nothing in her hands. She walked in silence, across the wide-open ground, toward the 5 young men who were her sons, and every wolf in that valley felt the gathering around her of something they could not name, the presence of a bloodline waking up, a seal that had spent its last power, a gravity that had been contained for decades finally permitted to be what it was. She stopped beside her sons and faced the crowd. She did not look for Cale immediately. She knew he was there. She could feel the specific shape of his presence the way you can feel the temperature of something you are not yet touching. When her eyes found him at last, she held his gaze for exactly 1 moment, steady, clear, and free of everything except the truth of what she had survived. His face told her what she needed to know. He remembered. He had always remembered. Ronan spoke into the silence. His voice was even and carrying, the voice of a man who has spent years learning how to fill a room with nothing but certainty. "Our mother was cast from Silvercrest 18 years ago. She was innocent. We are here to prove that, to correct the record, and to claim what the law says belongs to us." He paused. "We are not here for revenge. We are here for the truth, and we are going to stay until we have it." Nobody spoke. Then Kieran, who had said almost nothing since they arrived, added in a voice considerably quieter than his brother's, but no less final, "Try to remove us if you disagree." Still nobody spoke. Celeste, standing 3 yards to Cale's right, was the color of ash. Her hands, Amara noticed, were not quite steady. Good. The reckoning had arrived. Not loudly. Not with the performance of fury. With the simple, irresistible weight of something that had been a long time coming and was no longer willing to wait. Silas had spent 15 years preparing for what he did on the first morning of the formal proceedings. He had done it quietly, without drama, in the way he did most things. Through the careful network of contacts Marin had helped him build, scholars, former pack members who had reason to distrust Celeste's family, a retired Silvercrest warrior who had carried guilt for 18 years, and one key individual, whose identity Silas had spent 2 years tracking down, he had assembled something that the law of every pack recognized as unchallengeable, a complete chain of evidence. He presented it in the main pavilion, in front of the assembled elders and all attending delegations. He was composed throughout. He did not perform outrage. He simply placed one fact after another on the table, like pieces of a structure that built itself as he spoke. The first piece was the rogue scent token. Most people in Silvercrest had forgotten the specifics of what it was. A small leather pouch containing a concentration of the territorial markers used by unaffiliated wolves, presented as evidence that Amara had been in contact with rogues. Silas had found the woman who made it. She was 60 years old now. living quietly in a settlement 2 territories away, and she had spent 18 years waiting for someone to find her, because the weight of what she had done had never gotten lighter. Her written testimony, witnessed by 3 independent elders, described in full detail who had commissioned the token, what she had been paid, and what she had been threatened with if she ever spoke. Celeste's name appeared in that testimony 11 times. The second piece was the witness statements from the night of the accusation. 2 wolves had claimed to have seen Amara at the eastern fence, meeting with outsiders. Silas had located both of them. One had died 4 years prior, but his widow had found, after his death, a letter he had written and never sent, addressed to no one in particular, describing what had actually happened that night and why he had lied. The letter had been kept in a box under her bed. She had sent it to Silas when he wrote to her, with a note that said she had been hoping someone would ask. The second witness was still alive, older, and when Silas contacted him, he had agreed to appear. He stood in the pavilion now, a slight man of middle age, and he told the truth in a flat, exhausted voice that had the texture of someone putting down something very heavy at last. The third piece was Celeste herself. Dorian had spent the 3 days since their arrival in quiet conversations across the gathering. He had spoken with delegates from 6 different packs, with the hosting council, with 3 members of the Silvercrest Elder Panel who had been junior members at the time of Amara's banishment, and had always had small, private doubts they had never voiced. He had not made threats. He had not made promises he could not keep. He had simply talked, person to person, with the particular gift he had for making people feel that they were speaking to someone who genuinely understood the difference between being complicit and being cornered. By the time the proceedings began, Celeste had no allies in the room who were willing to defend her publicly. She understood this before Silas finished speaking. Amara watched her understand it, watched the calculation run behind her eyes, the rapid assessment of options, the moment when every option came up short. Celeste was a smart woman. She had always been a smart woman. She had simply spent her smartness on the wrong project for 18 years, and now the accounting had come due. She stood up before Silas had finished. The room turned to look at her. "I want to speak," she said. The elder moderating the proceedings, not Warren, who had recused himself given the emotional weight of his reaction the day before, but a woman from the Greywood Council named Philippa, looked at her steadily. "You will have your opportunity," she said, "when Silas has finished. I want to speak now. Sit down, please." Celeste sat. Her expression was controlled, but her hands were flat on the table in front of her, with the specific flatness of someone pressing down on something they cannot allow to move. Silas finished. He did so without flourish, ending simply with the summary that the evidence, taken as a whole, established not only that Amara had been innocent of every charge, but that the banishment had been achieved through deliberate and coordinated deception. He then sat down, and in the silence that followed, the only sound was the wind moving through the pavilion's open sides. Philippa looked at Celeste. "You may speak." Celeste stood. She had rehearsed this. Amara could tell. There was a structure to what she said, a prepared quality. She said that the original evidence had been presented in good faith, that she had believed it to be accurate, that she deeply regretted any harm that had come to Amara, and that she was willing to formally acknowledge that an error in judgment had been made. She used the word error 4 times. She did not once say that she had done it. The room was quiet when she finished. Then Kieran, sitting with his arms crossed and his expression entirely calm, said, "The woman who made the token named you specifically. The witness named you specifically. The letter from the dead man named you specifically. An error in judgment is when you misjudge distance. What you're describing is something else." Celeste looked at him. "I don't know who those people are, or what they have been paid to say." Kieran raised an eyebrow. "The woman who made the token has had no contact with our family. We found her through old merchant records. The living witness reached out to Silas directly 6 months ago. The dead man's widow is here, in this pavilion right now. Would you like to point to her and make that claim to her face?" He was not loud. He did not need to be. The room felt the weight of the question the same way it had felt the weight of the 5 arrivals the day before, as something that settled into the bones rather than something that struck at the surface. Celeste sat down. Philippa called a recess. During the recess, Cale asked to speak with Amara privately. She considered refusing. She had prepared herself, over 18 years, to not need anything from him. Not his apology, Not his explanation, not his regret. She had arrived at a place where she genuinely did not require those things. But she could see, in the way he asked, quietly, with Oliver deliberately standing out of earshot, with none of the authority of an alpha and all of the uncertainty of a man asking for something he does not deserve, that he needed to say it, and she was, at her core, not the kind of person who denied people things they needed when the cost to herself was manageable. She agreed. They stood at the edge of the neutral fire, away from the main pavilion. The fire burned between them, low in the midday, reduced to glowing coals. Cale was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the fire. Then he looked at her. "I knew," he said. "Not that night, but by the second year, I knew." "What did you know?" she said. "That it was wrong. All of it." He paused. "I told myself I needed more time, more evidence, that acting without certainty would be irresponsible for the pack. I stayed in the comfortable space of not being certain, because being certain would have required me to do something I had already decided it was too late to do." "Admit you were wrong in public," she said. "Yes?" Amara looked at the fire. "My sons do not know the specifics of this conversation," she said. "When Ronan finds out you let this go on for 16 years after you knew, he is going to be harder on you than he is on Celeste. Ronan has strong opinions about the distance between knowing something and doing something." Cale nodded once. "He should." "He is your son," she said. It was the first time she had said it to him directly, and it landed in the air between them with a specificity that neither of them moved away from. Cale said nothing for a long moment. Then, very quietly, "All five of them?" "All five of them." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the haunting that had lived in his face for 18 years had not gone. It would not go, she knew, for some time. But something alongside it had shifted. Not relief, something closer to reckoning. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that is." "Not what I came for," she said calmly. "I told you that yesterday." "I know. I needed to say it anyway." She looked at him for a moment. Then it said, "Now go back in there and tell the Elder Council what you told me. All of it, including the part about the second year." He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. "You're not asking for my forgiveness," she said. "You're asking for your own. That's between you and the Moon Goddess. What I need from you is the truth, on record, where it will stand for as long as these packs exist. That I can use. Your remorse, I cannot." He nodded again, and then he went back into the pavilion, and he told the council everything. That afternoon, Dorian was in the inner ring of the gathering, when the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The formal challenge to the Silvercrest ruling position. It was not Kieran who issued it, as many had expected. It was Ronan, and he did not issue it as a challenge in the traditional sense. He stood before the Silvercrest Elder panel and presented, with Silas beside him to answer questions, the legal case for succession based on lineage. He did not need to fight for it. The law was clear, and the law had been Silas's specialty for 15 years. The eldest of the Silvercrest elders, a woman named Dora, who had been present the night of Amara's banishment and had carried her own private accounting of that night since, listened to the full case without interrupting. When it was done, she looked at the other two elders beside her. A brief, silent communication passed between the three of them. Dora turned back to the room. "The Silvercrest Elder Council acknowledges the validity of the lineage claim," she said. "The matter of leadership succession will be addressed at a formal pack assembly within 10 days. Celeste rose. "This is—" "Sit down," Dora said, in the voice of a woman who had been done with someone for 18 years and was finally permitted to say so. "You have said everything you are going to say today." Celeste sat. Kieran, from his place against the pavilion wall, uncrossed his arms. The session was going to close before there was any physical challenge, which was fine. The outcome was no longer in question. He looked at Dorian across the room. Dorian gave him a small, satisfied nod. Outside, in the clearing between the pavilion and the neutral fire, Orion was sitting alone on a low stone near the edge of the grounds, watching the direction where the northern forest would be, though it was too far away to see. He was the youngest of 5 and the most powerful of all of them, and he had said very little since they arrived, as was his way. A young wolf from the Crestwood delegation drifted over and sat near him without quite knowing why, drawn the way people were always drawn to Orion's proximity, and after a moment said awkwardly, "Are you one of the Silvercrest claimants?" Orion glanced at him. "Moonborn," he said quietly. The young wolf was not sure what that meant. "Is that a pack?" "No," Orion said. He looked back toward the north. "It's older than packs." Inside the pavilion, the session closed. The verdict of the day was not a verdict yet. That would come in stages, each one building on the one before it, until the structure was complete. But the foundation was laid, and it was solid, and nothing built on solid ground falls back into the earth without a great deal more force than Celeste or anyone like her could now bring to bear. Amara stepped out of the pavilion into the afternoon light and turned her face up toward the sky for a moment, eyes closed. The sun was warm, the air was clear. Somewhere above her, a bird was calling in a language she had spent enough years in the northern forest to almost understand. She did not feel triumphant. What she felt was simpler and stronger than that. She felt as if the vow she had made at a border stone 18 years ago, in bare feet in the dark, had been heard, not just by herself, by something larger. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world was in the correct alignment. The claiming ceremony was not held at Silvercrest, it was held at the summit grounds, in front of all the assembled packs, because what was being claimed was not a territory. Silas had made the legal case over 2 weeks of careful, methodical work. He had presented it in sections. First, the proof of lineage, then the unbroken continuity of the Moonborn succession, then the ancient compact that had been signed by the founders of every current pack, a document that predated the current pack system by 400 years, and that most packs legal scholars had not read in full because the reading list of a pack legal scholar rarely went that far back. Silas had read everything. The compact established, in language that was old but not unclear, that in the event the Moonborn royal line re-emerged with verified succession, the founding covenant of the Wolf Nation renewed itself automatically. The seat that had been vacant for 1,000 years did not need to be created. It needed only to be acknowledged. The Crestwood Elder Council authenticated the document. The Greywood Council confirmed its interpretation. 3 independent legal scholars from outside any affiliated pack reviewed the succession evidence and issued their findings in writing. The process took exactly 12 days. On the 13th day, the ceremony was held at sunrise. The neutral fire was built higher than usual, 4 times its ordinary height, burning with a blue-white center that Orion had tended through the night. Marin had come from the northern forest for this, traveling at a pace that suggested she was more capable of speed than she usually let on. She stood at Amara's right throughout the proceedings, small and still, and wearing an expression of completed purpose. One by one, the assembled delegations acknowledged the succession. This was not a forced submission. The ancient compact had included specific language about voluntary continuation, recognizing that a unified wolf nation was only a real thing if it chose to be real. Each delegation had been given 3 days to deliberate privately. Every one of them returned to the gathering ground. Even the packs that had been most resistant, 2 territorial leaders whose first instinct had been refusal, came, because Dorian had spent those 3 days in conversations that were, by all accounts, extraordinary. He did not threaten, he did not bargain. He explained, in specific terms, what unified law had actually looked like under the Moonborn system. Not a central authority stripping pack autonomy, but a framework of shared standards that made the border disputes and the trade arguments and the rogue management crises, the things that consumed enormous pack resources every year, manageable through common process rather than individual conflict. He described the compact not as a surrender, but as an efficiency. He was 21 years old, and he convinced 6 territorial alphas in 3 days. Ronan took the formal position of High Regent, which was the closest modern equivalent to the old Moonborn administrative role, the executive function, the one who actually managed the day-to-day operation of the unified law framework. He accepted it with the same expression he had been born with, serious and fully present, and when the elder from the oldest pack present placed the symbolic sigil of office around his neck, Ronan looked out at the assembled wolves and said 3 sentences. "We are not here to rule over you. We are here to hold what belongs to all of us, the law, the covenant, the peace that nobody maintains alone. If we ever stop serving that, remove us." That's in the compact too. There was a long silence, And then the sound that rose from the assembled wolves was not cheering. It was something older, a sound that came from the chest rather than the throat, a resonance that rolled across the valley and up into the hills, and had not been heard in the Wolf Nation for 1,000 years. Kieran took the position of High Warden, the enforcement arm of the unified system, the one who ensured that the shared law had consequence. He was efficient about it. He selected 12 senior warriors from different packs as his initial council, balanced the representation carefully, and immediately began the work of establishing what the enforcement standards would look like in practice. He had been thinking about this for years. Silas became the keeper of the record, not a legal title in the old system, but a new one he had designed himself, because the compact needed someone whose specific function was making sure the document and its history were never again lost or distorted. He began, immediately, the compilation of the full, unedited history of the Moonborn line to be copied and distributed to every pack's library. He said this was insurance. If the story existed in enough places, it could not be buried again. Dorian had been offered a formal position in the new structure. He declined it. He told Ronan he was more useful without a title, which was accurate. He moved freely between delegations, sat in on disputes, built relationships with the quiet persistence of someone who understood that the formal structure was only as strong as the informal trust beneath it. Within a month, there was no significant leader in the Wolf Nation who did not know his name. Orion had no title at all. Nobody suggested one. The Elder Warren, who had knelt at the neutral fire the day of their arrival, explained to the other elders privately that some things in the old system did not have titles because they existed prior to the need for titles. Orion was the Moonborn of his generation, the one in whom the full gift ran clearest. He was not an administrator, or a warrior, or a diplomat. He was a presence. The Wolf Nation would know what to do with that in time. He spent most of the first weeks of the new order sitting near the boundary stones of the valley, in quiet conversation with wolves who came to find him, not because they were sent, but because something in them recognized that there was a specific kind of problem that only came right when you sat near a particular fire and said the thing you had not said to anyone else. He was 21, and he had the patience of someone 5 times his age, and he turned nobody away. The matter of Celeste was addressed in the formal proceedings on the 3rd day of the ceremony period. Philippa, who had moderated the first session and had been chosen by unanimous agreement to handle the resolution process, laid out the determination of the Elder Council with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about how to say something without softening it into dishonesty. The evidence established beyond reasonable dispute that Celeste had deliberately caused the wrongful banishment of Amara through the manufacture of false evidence and the procurement of false witness. The harm caused was not minor or temporary. It was 18 years of exile for an innocent woman, and the complete disruption of a succession that was the rightful inheritance of 5 individuals now sitting in this council. The harm extended to every pack that had operated without the Moonborn framework for those 18 years, which had direct consequences for the border disputes, rogue management failures, and territory conflicts that had consumed resources across the Wolf Nation in that period. The sentence was banishment. Celeste did not show her reaction. She was very controlled, and she stayed that way until the very end of the proceeding, when the escort party was established and the route was laid out and the details were final and there was nothing left to be controlled. Then, briefly, her composure cracked, not into tears, but into something harder and more fragile at the same time, a recognition that had been held at arm's length for 2 weeks and could not be held back any longer. She looked at Amara across the council hall. Amara looked back at her. She did not look away. She also did not speak. There was nothing she needed to say to Celeste. She had needed, from the beginning, the truth on record, and the truth was on record. What Celeste felt about that was Celeste's own. The other wolves who had participated in the original deception, the 2 witnesses, those still living, and 3 members of the Silvercrest Elder Council who had allowed the proceeding to move forward without adequate investigation, received lesser sanctions appropriate to their level of involvement. Dora, who had been one of those junior elders and had cooperated fully with the investigation, was given a formal acknowledgement of her cooperation and permitted to continue in her role. Kale stood before the council and told the full truth, including the 2nd year and the 16 years after it. He did not minimize it or frame it generously. He said what he had done, and what he had not done, and he said it clearly. Philippa observed that his testimony was the most complete and unambiguous account they had received from anyone in the Silvercrest leadership, and that his cooperation from the first day of proceedings had been material to the outcome. He formally abdicated the alpha position of Silvercrest and pledged his cooperation to the new unified framework, requesting assignment to the Border Patrol program that Kieran was building, the lowest-level operational role available to a former alpha. Kieran considered this request for approximately 4 seconds and approved it. There was one final element of the ceremony. The elder Warren, recovered from the weight of the first days, stood before the assembled packs at the peak of the ceremony. He was very old and he moved carefully, but his voice when he spoke was steady. He said that in 30 years of waiting and 40 years of study, he had held on to the belief that the Moonborn Covenant was not simply a legal document. It was a promise the Moon Goddess had made to the Wolf Nation, that there would always be, in every generation, something worth being unified around. Something that made the individual strength of each pack into the collective strength of all packs, without asking any of them to be less than they were. He said that in his opinion, which he offered humbly as one old wolf who had spent a life in the company of these texts, the 5 young men standing before them, and the woman who had raised them were the fullest expression of that promise he had ever witnessed. Not because they were perfect, not because they had not made mistakes in the last 2 weeks, because they had, small ones, the ordinary miscalculations of young people navigating something enormous, but because they were exactly what 1,000 years of waiting had produced, not conquerors, not rulers in the old sense, but people who had been built by their circumstances to know precisely what service actually meant. He sat down. He looked tired and satisfied in equal measure. The last part of the ceremony was the simplest. Amara stood at the center of the neutral fire as the sun cleared the valley's eastern ridge and the light fell full across the grounds. The fire was behind her, blue-white and steady in the windless morning. Her sons stood in a half-circle at her back. One by one, the delegations acknowledged her. Not as a ruler. The compact did not grant her a title. She was not the High Regent, not the Warden, not any of the functional roles the new structure had defined. The compact had a different language for what she was. In the old tongue, the word translated to something close to Luna Mother, but that was not quite right either. The older sense of it was more like the one in whom the covenant lives. She stood in the morning light and received each acknowledgement with the same stillness she had built over 18 years in a northern forest, with 5 boys pulling at her, and Marin's voice reading old texts aloud, and the seal on her wolf dissolving year by year, until what was underneath it could breathe. She was 40 years old and she had been afraid many times, and she had kept going anyway, and she had done the most difficult thing she knew of. She had raised human beings who were also something beyond human, and she had done it in a way that left them intact. She thought about the border stone. She thought about the wet ground under her bare feet, the cold, the total darkness ahead of her, and the terrifying smallness of a body that was carrying more than it knew. She thought about what it had taken to put one foot in front of the other that night, and every night after, for 18 years. The last delegation made its acknowledgement. The ceremony closed. Orion came to stand beside her. He was the youngest of her sons, and the quietest, and he took her hand, which he had not done in years, because he was 21, and generally conducted himself with the gravity of someone twice that age. But here, now, in the morning light, he simply stood beside her and held her hand. The other 4 gathered close. Marin was a few yards away, watching, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been right about something for a very long time and finds no pleasure in saying so but deep satisfaction in seeing it be true. Amara looked at each of her sons in turn. She looked at the valley full of wolves who had come from every direction and chosen, freely, to be part of something larger than themselves. She looked at the border stone she had placed in her heart 18 years ago, the marker she had walked past into darkness with nothing but a vow. She had made them a promise that night, not in words, in the quiet language of a body that refused to stop, a mind that refused to go dark, a heart that kept its accounting across 18 years and brought every single debt to collection. She had told them they would come back and collect what was always theirs. They had. Orion's hand was warm in hers. Around them, the morning continued its ordinary work. Birds moving, wind beginning, the fire settling from ceremony into comfortable warmth. The Wolf Nation, for the first time in 1,000 years, had something to come back to. Amara looked up at the sky and let the sun be warm on her face. The woman they had thrown into the dark had come back in the morning, and she had brought the dawn with her,